After my husband's funeral, my sister stood up in front of our entire family and claimed she'd had an affair with my dead husband, and that she deserved half of everything I owned. My husband wasn't even cold in the ground yet. 1 week. That's how long I had been a widow when I walked through my sister Vivian's garden gate, holding a wrapped gift for her 1-year-old son, trying to convince my body to keep functioning like a normal human being. 7 days since I had stood in the rain at Lakeview Memorial and watched them lower Elliot into the earth. 7 nights of reaching across the bed and finding cold sheets. Something was wrong the moment I arrived. I felt it before I could name it. The kind of atmospheric shift that happens in a room when everyone has been talking about you and they hear your footsteps coming down the hall. Conversations died mid-sentence. People looked away. Vivian's closest friend, Petra Halverson, opened the back gate before I even knocked, and the expression on her face, I will carry that expression for the rest of my life. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't the awkward, grief-adjacent pity I had grown accustomed to in the preceding week. It was something different, complicated, almost apologetic, like she was sorry for what was about to happen. My parents were already there, seated rigidly at one of the long picnic tables, my father's hand resting over my mother's in that habitual way he had. They looked uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with grief. My mother's smile when she saw me was a fraction too tight. I told myself it was fine. People didn't know how to act around widows. That was normal. I had read about it in the grief pamphlet the hospital had pressed into my hands before I left the parking structure. The social discomfort of bereavement. I was the walking reminder of mortality in their midst, and they didn't know where to put their eyes. I told myself that. I was wrong. Vivian came out of the house 12 minutes after I arrived. The timing, I would later understand, was deliberate. She had wanted an audience fully assembled. She had wanted me seated, off balance, a drink in my hand, socially committed to staying. She wore a dress I had never seen, emerald green, slightly formal for a garden birthday party, her hair freshly lightened, gold hoops in her ears. She was carrying Theo on her hip like a prop, his little party hat slightly askew, his eyes wide and bewildered at the crowd. She was confident, buzzing in a way that had nothing to do with maternal warmth, almost giddy. She set Theo down with the other children, picked up a spoon, and tapped it against the side of her glass. The chatter stopped. I want to say something, she announced, before we sing and cut the cake. I've been keeping a secret for a long time, one I can no longer, in good conscience, keep. I set down my water glass. My son Theo is not Damon's child. Her eyes moved across the assembled faces, landing finally on mine with a precision that told me this moment had been rehearsed many times. Theo is Elliot's. My brother-in-law and I had an affair that lasted 14 months. And since Theo is his biological son, his heir, I am legally entitled to half of my sister's $800,000 home. The yard went completely silent. Then sound returned in a wave. Gasps. A chair scraping against patio stone. My father rose to his feet so fast he knocked against the table. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. A short, compressed syllable of shock that she quickly smothered behind her hand. Vivienne reached into a folder she had positioned on the table behind her. Elliot updated his will in the weeks before his death, she said, her voice almost gentle now, performing compassion. He wanted his son provided for. I understand this is difficult, but I am doing what Elliot asked. She held up a folded document. It's all here. Every face in that yard turned toward me. The grief-stricken widow, the wronged woman, the pathetic, golden child whose husband had secretly fathered her sister's baby. I could read it on all of them. The pity, the horror, the shameful sliver of morbid fascination that people can't suppress when catastrophe arrives in person. My own sister. Standing in the yard she rented with her son on his first birthday, making this accusation in front of our parents, in front of aunts and cousins and neighbors I'd known since I was 7 years old, claiming half of the house I had lived in with my husband for 9 years. I noticed something strange rising in my chest. Not rage, not the obliterating grief that had been my constant companion for 7 days, not even humiliation, laughter, not the warm kind, the involuntary kind, the kind that crawls up when something is so catastrophically, outrageously false that your nervous system doesn't know what instrument to reach for. It pushed against the backs of my teeth and I pressed my lips together hard enough to feel them go white. I breathed once through my nose. Oh, I said, completely calm. I see. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, considered sip. May I look at that document, Vivian? Something moved across her face. The faintest flicker of uncertainty, because she had expected tears. She had expected collapse. She had prepared for a woman destroyed, not a woman asking to see the paperwork. She crossed the yard and handed it over. I took my time with it. I sat at the picnic table in the afternoon sun, and I read it slowly, the way Elliot used to read contracts, paragraph by paragraph. I was listening for the language. 11 years of watching a corporate attorney bring work home trains you to hear what's missing. The structure was wrong. The indemnification clauses were positioned incorrectly. The signature block used a format I had never seen on any of Elliot's firm documents. And the signature itself. I knew Elliot's signature the way I knew the sound of his voice. He had signed our mortgage, our joint accounts, our marriage certificate. He had signed birthday cards in the cramped left-leaning script he'd had since law school. The connecting stroke between the E and the L was specific, almost rushed. The final T's crossbar angled slightly upward. The signature on Vivian's document was a forgery. A competent attempt, but an amateur one. The connecting stroke was wrong. The final flourish was overcomplicated. The way people sign when they're trying to look like someone someone else rather than trying to sign quickly. I folded it. I handed it back. "Thank you," I said. "This is Theo's day. We should talk privately. I'll call you this week and we'll sit down together." Vivienne stared at me. "That's it?" she said. Her voice had gone slightly thin. "That's all you have to say?" "That's it." I stood. I went to my parents, kissed my mother's cheek, told my father I would call him in the morning. I found Petra still hovering near the gate and thanked her for opening the door. Then I walked to my car, climbed in, pulled the door shut, and sat in the driveway for 30 seconds. Then I let the laugh come. To understand what happened in that yard, you have to understand who Elliot and I were, and who Vivienne was, and the long, slow geography of resentment between the three of us. Elliot Cross and I met in 2009 at a firm holiday party neither of us particularly wanted to attend. I was 31. I was working in corporate communications for a mid-sized real estate development company in Chicago. He was 29. He was 3 years into his career at Harmon Leach, a downtown firm that specialized in commercial contracts. We were introduced by a mutual colleague who later admitted she had engineered the encounter deliberately. He was the kind of person who made you feel, within 20 minutes of meeting him, that you were entirely worth listening to. Not performatively, not as a technique. He simply paid attention. I spent most of that party standing near the window with him, talking about property law and the novel I'd been failing to finish for 2 years. And somewhere between the second drink and the coat check, I understood that I was in some kind of trouble. We were married in June of 2012 at the Botanical Garden in Glencoe. We bought our house in Evanston in the summer of 2013, a 4-bedroom Craftsman on Ashland Avenue, 2 blocks from the lake, with a garden that Elliot immediately began overrunning with tomatoes and ornamental sage. We were happy. That word gets used casually, but I mean it precisely. We were genuinely, quietly, specifically happy in the way that has nothing to do with the absence of difficulty. We had problems. Elliot worked long hours and sometimes disappeared into cases in a way that made him feel very far away. We lost a pregnancy in 2016, and that grief sat between us for almost a year before we figured out how to grieve it together instead of separately. We disagreed about money management, about how often to visit my parents in Naperville, about whether the kitchen needed new countertops or whether that was a waste. But underneath all of it was something solid, something I trusted the way I trusted the structure of the house. He was mine and I was his, and I never, not once, not in 11 years, had reason to question that. My sister Vivienne was 4 years younger than me. She was 33 at the time of Elliot's death, the kind of beautiful that makes people overlook things they shouldn't overlook. She had grown up in my shadow, which is not a criticism. It's just a fact of geometry. I was the older one, the one who went to Northwestern, the one who landed a career before the rest of my college friends had finished their first internships. I was the daughter my parents led with in conversations with their friends. Vivienne was talented and smart and chronically underestimated, including by herself. She had cycled through 3 careers before she was 30: graphic design, event planning, a brief and expensive attempt at starting a specialty candle business, and had accumulated the kind of debt that accumulates when you're talented but undisciplined with money. Damon was her partner of 6 years, the father of Theo. He was a contractor, good-natured, unremarkable in most respects. They had moved in together in 2017, renting an apartment in Wicker Park that I knew Vivienne had always found insufficient. She wanted more. She always wanted more than she had, and she was always, in some low-level perpetual way, resentful of the fact that I seemed to have gotten it without trying. That wasn't true, of course. Nobody gets what they have without trying. But resentment doesn't operate on facts. Vivienne had developed what I can only describe as a fixation on Elliot. I noticed it early, maybe 2014, as the kind of flirtatious behavior that some women perform toward their sisters' husbands as a reflex, a way of feeling noticed. I mentioned it to Elliot once, and he had looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time. "I know," he said. "I handle it." There was a specific incident at Christmas of 2017 that I only fully understood much later. We were at my parents' house in Naperville. Vivienne had had too much wine and had said something to Elliot in the kitchen. I had come in to find them standing near the counter, Vivienne with her hand on his arm in a way that was a fraction too familiar. Elliot's body language slightly closed off. He moved toward me immediately when I walked in. Vivienne laughed something off. I let it go. I let it go because I trusted him, because the alternative was a conflict I didn't have the energy for during Christmas, because I told myself I was reading too much into it. He had not been reading too much into it. I had been sitting in the parking lot of that party for 30 seconds when my phone rang. It was my father. "Nora," his voice was tight. "Come home. I mean our home. Come to the house tonight. Don't go back to Evanston alone." "I'm okay, Dad. I know you are. Come anyway." I drove to Naperville that evening and sat at my parents' kitchen table while my mother made the chamomile tea she had made for every family crisis since I was 8 years old. My father sat across from me with his hands flat on the table. "I don't believe it," he said. "Any of it. You understand that. I know. Your mother and I both. We know who Elliot was." My mother set the tea in front of me and said nothing. Her silence was its own statement. I thought about the document, about the signature. I thought about what I actually knew, which was considerably more than I had been ready to deploy in a backyard in front of 40 people. I thought about the safety deposit box. Elliot had told me about it in October of the previous year. We had been sitting in the garden, the tomatoes were spent, the sage going woody at the base, the kind of late-season afternoon that already has November in it. He had been unusually quiet for several days. I had asked him what was wrong. "I want to tell you about about something, he said. Something I've put together, just in case. Just in case. Elliot was a lawyer. His entire professional life was organized around contingencies. He had built our estate plan when I was 34, a decade before any of our friends had thought about it. He had a document for everything. He told me about the box. He had been keeping it at First Northern on Davis Street for 3 years, adding to it over time. He said the key was in the filing cabinet in his office, in an envelope labeled seasonal policies, because, he said with a slight smile, nobody looked in envelopes labeled seasonal policies. What's in it? I had asked. Everything you might need, he said, if something happens to me, and a few things you might need if Vivian ever decides to do something more drastic. I had looked at him. More drastic than what? He had looked back at me steadily. She's made several approaches, Nora. I've kept records. I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily when nothing had come of it, but I think you should know there is documentation, if it ever becomes relevant. I should have pressed him. I should have made him tell me everything right then, sitting in the dying garden with the last of the season's warmth on our faces. Instead, I had taken his hand and said I trusted him, and he had said he trusted me, and we had sat there until the light went. 2 months later, he was dead. A cardiac event. Fast. He had felt unwell during a Tuesday morning meeting, excused himself, collapsed in the corridor outside the third-floor conference room of Harmon Leach's downtown offices. He was 41 years old. He had been quietly managing a congenital heart condition for 3 years, something that had been diagnosed at a routine physical, and that he had handled with medication, diet, and the particular stoicism of a man who had decided not to make his health everyone else's problem. I found out about the diagnosis from his cardiologist at the hospital, standing in the corridor with my coat still on. He had been going to tell me. I believed that. I believe it still. I drove to First Northern on Davis Street the morning after Theo's birthday party. The key was exactly where he said it would be. Envelope labeled seasonal policies, middle drawer of the filing cabinet, under a folder of outdated auto insurance documents. I had not looked for it before this. I had not known I would need to. The safety deposit box was organized with the methodical precision of a man who had spent his career making sure critical documents could be located under pressure. Everything was labeled. Everything was in chronological order. His legitimate will was there, notarized by a notary public on October 11th, witnessed by 2 colleagues at his firm, legally filed with Cook County. I read through it, standing in the small private room the bank had given me. It was straightforward, everything to me, with provisions for charitable donations to 2 organizations he cared about, and a specific bequest to his younger brother in Portland. There was nothing in it about Theo. There was nothing in it about Vivian. There was no second will. There was no codicil. There was nothing. Beneath the will was a sealed medical file, a summary document from his physician with a date stamp from 4 years ago. I read it once. Then I sat down. 2 years before Theo was born, Elliot had undergone a medical procedure, a vasectomy performed in the spring at a private urology practice in Streeterville that neither of us had ever mentioned to anyone. Not my parents, not his family, nobody. We had made that decision together after the pregnancy loss in 2016, both of us needing to close a door on the possibility of future losses rather than let it remain open and raw. It had been a private grief and a private resolution. I had asked him in the car on the way home from the clinic if he ever regretted it. He had said, "No, you're what I chose. That was always going to be enough." I had laughed at the time because it was so like him to say something that landed exactly between romantic and clinical. I had not understood what it meant in terms of Vivian's claim. I understood it now. There was no biological possibility. None. The dates on the medical records predated Theo's conception by 18 months. If Theo was Elliot's biological son, it would require a timeline that violated basic human physiology. Beneath the medical file was a green moleskin journal, Elliot's handwriting, small and precise. I recognized it as the journal he kept in his desk at home. I had assumed it was case notes. I had never opened it. I had not thought to look for it since his death. It contained 3 years of documentation, dates, locations, exact words. Every time Vivian had said something inappropriate, every time she had texted him something that crossed a line, every time she had found a reason to be alone with him at a family event and steered the conversation somewhere it shouldn't go, he had been scrupulous, specific. He had noted his own responses each time, the polite deflections, the changes of subject, the one occasion in March of 2020 where he had told her directly and clearly that her behavior was not acceptable and that he would tell me about it if it continued. She had stopped for 8 months after that. Then she had started again. At the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope, my name on the front, in his handwriting. I held it for a long time. Then I opened it. "My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, something has happened, and I am sorry I am not there. I am sorry for whatever you have had to do to find this letter, and I am sorry it took me this long to write it. What I want you to know first is that I never gave her what she wanted. I want you to hear that from me directly. Even now, there was nothing. There was only ever you. I documented what happened because I am a lawyer, and because I believed, given her pattern of behavior, that she might one day try something that required a response beyond my own word. I hope I was wrong. If you are reading this, I was probably not wrong. The medical records will explain what she cannot have done. My legitimate will is here as well. The journal is complete through last month. There is also a folder of text records that I had printed and notarized. Copies of everything she sent me with dates. Use what you need. Do not feel guilty about using it. She is not who she has allowed you to believe she is. You have been the the best thing. You have always been the best thing. I love you, Nora. Take care of the garden. Elliot. I sat in that vault for a long time. I was not crying in a way that felt like grief. I was crying in a way that felt like being held. He had known. He had loved me with enough foresight to build me something to stand on when the ground gave way. I pulled myself together. I drove home. I called a private investigator named Marcus Aldridge, who had been recommended to me by a colleague who dealt with estate litigation. I told him what I had and what I needed. He told me to give him 72 hours. Marcus was efficient and thorough. He laid the folder on my dining room table 3 days later with the quiet manner of someone who had learned long ago not to be visibly shocked by the things people did to one another. Vivian was $74,800 in debt, 3 credit cards, a personal loan, and 2 months of overdue rent on the Wicker Park apartment. Damon had left her 5 months after Theo's birth, not dramatically, not with a blowout fight, but the quiet and final way of a person who had simply decided they were done and had gone. She had no child support agreement in place. She had no savings. Then Marcus slid a second page across the table, printed text messages. He had obtained them through a mutual contact of Vivian and Petra's, someone who had been disturbed enough by what they'd witnessed in the planning of this scheme to provide them voluntarily. They were dated across a 6-week period ending 3 days before Theo's birthday party. The first one was from Vivian to Petra 3 weeks before the party. Elliot's death is terrible, but maybe this is finally my chance. I've been thinking about something. Petra's response? What kind of something? Vivian. You know Nora has that house in Evanston, $800,000, and if I could show that Theo was his? Petra. Are you serious? Vivian. I've never been more serious. I need a will. Dave is good with Photoshop. He can work from the templates online. There were 11 more messages in the chain. They detailed the planning of the forged document, the decision to announce it publicly rather than privately in order to preempt any quiet resolution, the calculation that I would be too devastated to think clearly enough to fight back. Nora has always been the golden child. She gets the good husband, the good house, the good life, and she just gets to keep all of it while I drown. Time for me to get my share. I read that one 3 times, not with rage, with a kind of exhausted sadness. She had turned whatever the truth of her life was into a story where I was the villain, and she had turned that story into a plan, and the plan had required her to stand in her son's birthday party and lie about a dead man. My phone was on the table. I picked it up. I called her. Vivian. Nora. Her voice had the careful, slightly elevated tone of someone who had expected this call and prepared for it. I've had time to think about what you said. We need to talk properly. Come to the house on Thursday at 2. Bring whatever documentation you have. A pause. I knew you'd come around, she said. The smugness was barely concealed. I'll be there. She arrived at the Ashland Avenue house at 2:04 on Thursday afternoon. She was dressed carefully again, not quite as formal as the birthday party, but considered. She wore small pearl earrings. She had an accordion folder under her arm. She was doing the thing she always did when she felt she had won something, a kind of suppressed brightness in her face, the energy of someone trying very hard to appear generous in victory. I let her in. I took her coat. I offered her coffee, which she accepted. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where Elliot and I had eaten breakfast for 9 years, where he had read case notes on Sunday mornings in his oldest flannel shirt. She began talking before I had finished pouring, something about wanting to do this amicably, about how she hadn't wanted to have to do it this way, about how she hoped we could remain sisters through all of this. Her tone was measured, even kind. She had prepared a role for herself, the reluctant truth-teller. I let her talk. When she finished, I placed Elliot's medical records on the table between us. She looked at them. She looked up at me. I watched the color leave her face in a single fast recession, like a tide pulling back. Elliot had a vasectomy, I said, in April of 2019, at a private practice in Streeterville. The documentation is dated and notarized. I tapped the file. Theo was conceived in the late spring of 2021, based on his birth date. The medical timeline makes your claim biologically impossible. She said nothing. I placed the legitimate will beside the medical records. This is Elliot's actual will. Notarized October 11th of last year. Witnessed by 2 colleagues at Harmon Leach. Filed with Cook County. There is no secondary will. There is no codicil. There is nothing regarding Theo or regarding you. Still nothing. This is Elliot's journal. I placed the moleskin on the table. He kept records of your behavior going back to 2019. Every incident is dated. Every advance is documented, along with his response. Her mouth moved slightly. Nothing came out. This is a folder of text messages between you and Petra, obtained from a third party and notarized. I placed Marcus's printed sheets on the stack, including your communications with your friend Dave about what he was able to do with Photoshop and a will template. She was not performing anymore. The pearl earrings, the careful outfit, the rehearsed composure, all of it had dissolved. She was sitting across from me with her hands in her lap, and she looked like someone who had walked through a door she had been certain would open and found a wall on the other side. I turned off the recorder. I looked at my sister. For a moment, I felt something I had not expected. Not triumph, something more complicated and harder to carry. We had grown up together in the same house on the same street. I had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway of our parents' house in Naperville in the summer of 1995. I had driven her to the hospital when she thought she was having an appendicitis attack at 19, and it had turned out to be nothing. I had been in the waiting room when Theo was born, before I knew what I know now. She looked at me then, really looked at me, the performance fully gone. I needed the money, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, very small. I didn't know what else to do. That's not a justification, I said. It's not even an explanation. I know. What you did was fraud. What you said about Elliot in front of our family was slander. You forged a legal document. You stood up at your son's birthday party and said things that were categorically false about a man who has been dead for 8 days. She looked at her hands. You need to call our parents today, I said. You need to tell them the truth, all of it. Her chin trembled. And then I'm going to speak with an attorney about what to do with the rest of this. She left 40 minutes later. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after I heard her car pull out of the driveway. The house was very quiet. The recorder was still on the table. The documents were in a neat stack where Elliot would have put them, edges aligned, the way he organized everything. The fallout was not neat or swift. These things never are. Vivian called our parents that evening and told them, and I spent 2 hours on the phone with my mother the next morning while she cycled through shock, grief, fury, and a kind of exhausted love for both of us that I did not deserve and did not know how to hold. My father said very little on the phone and came to Evanston the following Saturday and sat in Elliot's chair in the garden and helped me cut back the sage for winter and said everything he needed to say through the doing of it. Extended family required individual management. There were cousins who had been at the birthday party who needed the record corrected. There were aunts who had heard things secondhand and filled in the gaps with their own invention. I sent a brief factual email to the family members who needed to hear the truth from me directly, and I made clear that I would not be answering follow-up questions. Elliot's colleagues at Harmon Leach were extraordinary. His partner, a woman named Carolyn Reeves who had known him since his first year at the firm, called me within 48 hours of the birthday party. Word had reached them somehow, and offered the firm's assistance in any legal matter that arose. I took her up on it. The forged will document was referred to the state's attorney's office. The fraud investigation was handled by people who knew what they were doing. I did not have to carry that part alone. Vivian was not prosecuted in the end, not because she didn't deserve it, but because the state's attorney determined that the forged document had not technically been submitted to any court or financial institution, and because I made a decision, one I have never fully made peace with, not to push for criminal charges. I have asked myself many times whether that was mercy or avoidance. I still don't know the answer. What did happen was a formal demand letter from Caroline's firm, requiring Vivian to sign an acknowledgement of the fraudulent nature of the document, a formal retraction of her public statements, and an agreement to have no contact with me for 2 years. She signed it. She didn't fight it. Petra, I learned from my cousin Maya, had ended the friendship with Vivian in the weeks after the birthday party. She had not known the full scope of the plan. She had known enough and had stayed quiet about it, which was its own kind of participation, but she had apparently drawn some private line at learning about the forged will. This did not change my opinion of her meaningfully. Damon came back briefly in the late fall. He and Vivian did not reconcile, but he established a child support arrangement and began taking Theo on weekends. Whatever Theo's origin, he was a child who deserved consistency, and some small part of me felt relief at that. My mother told me, 6 months after everything, that Vivian had entered therapy. I told her I was glad to hear it and meant it. There is a version of my sister that I love, that I have always loved, and it is the version that existed before whatever calculation she made about what I owed her and what she was willing to do to collect it. That version of her exists somewhere. I don't know if I will get to know her again. I planted tomatoes in the garden the following May, the same variety Elliot preferred, a beefsteak cultivar from the seed company in Vermont that he ordered from every spring, because he believed with the specific passion he brought to small domestic pleasures that the mail order seeds were meaningfully better than anything from the nursery. I am 44 now. I live alone on Ashland Avenue, 2 blocks from the lake, in the house Elliot and I chose together. I have gone back to work. I have let friends sit in the kitchen, and I have let them bring food, and I have let myself, slowly and incompletely, be comforted. I still reach for his side of the bed sometimes. I have stopped pretending otherwise. What I have understood, in the time since, in the grief work and the legal proceedings and the long, quiet evenings in a house that belonged to 2 people and now belongs to 1, is something that took me a long time to put into words. Elliot didn't leave me protected because he doubted me. He left me protected because he loved me with enough clarity to understand that love alone doesn't protect people from the things that happen after you're gone. He had been specific and careful and thorough, not because he distrusted me, but because he trusted the world accurately. My sister needed something from me that was never really about money. The house, the $800,000, the forged will, those were the instrument, not the thing. The thing was older and harder and had to do with a story she had been telling herself since we were children about what I had been given and what she had been denied. I can't fix that story. I couldn't have fixed it even if I'd wanted to. What I did, in the end, was exactly what he told me to do. I used what I needed. I did not feel guilty about using it. He loved me so thoroughly that he built me a shield before he died, and I am standing behind it still. Take care of the garden. I'm trying, Elliot. I'm trying.